good afternoon, or hello whenever you're listening to and watching this. This is the last formal lecture of the semester. I'm giving one more, just to remind you, on the final paper, but this covers everything you've done in summaries. It's only, so I've got this argument. We implement the purposes of qualitative research in data analysis. I mean, we're implementing those purposes in collection too, but we really do it in the analysis when we've got all our data and sit down and think about it. But there are many ways to do this. So the purposes, I'll be addressing those pretty quickly, whereas the ways to do it is the bulk of what I'm talking about today. I'm assuming we've already collected data. That's what I talked about in number 25. And I mean, I think there's still a little in the reading about collection. I'm just moving on. So I would say there are two purposes at least. I'm sure other sociologists would say there are more than two, but the minimum is that one could be trying to address causation in qualitative research. That's what I was trying to do. I noticed this gap between the United States and France, and really North America and Western Europe in terms of cycling history. And why? That's what occurred to me. Why was it so different? And I just didn't buy that it was automobiles, and it wasn't. Eventually it was, but at first it was not. So I was focused on causation, and a lot of qualitative researchers are focused on causation, and that means you have to understand the context, which means the conditions in which the causes operate. That's context, the social conditions. And that's got to deepen one's understanding of cause and effect. And in my case, it really did deepen my understanding of cause and effect in markets. Also, omitted causes or influences, formerly called omitted variables, the third criterion of asserting something causes an effect is making sure you don't have spurious correlations. And to do that, you have to make sure you've addressed all the possible influences. You haven't omitted any. And qualitative research is excellent at revealing specific causal mechanisms, the step-by-step process that a cause creates an effect, or in which a cause creates an effect. So even though I just said quite a few qualitative researchers are looking at causation, quite a few more are not. They're just trying to understand. They are interpreting someone else's reality. They're looking at least one point of view different from their own, and usually two or three or four or more different points of view. And this, it's not always true, but I think this is what people associate much more with the phrase qualitative research. Trying to understand others' points of view is it's over a century old in anthropology. That's what they've been doing pretty much from the start in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. So that's 150 years of trying to understand points of view, and certainly sociologists have been doing that about a century, as I said, in the Chicago School of Qualitative Research. So different cultural beliefs and practices, different ways of life, and crucially, to understand them without judging them. And again, I talked about this in the last one. This is really hard to do. You're trying to understand people who might hate you or hate your type of person. They might hate other people. They might just be filled with hate, and you just can't take that no matter what. You're not going to get anywhere if you just go, okay, you're bad, and I hate you too. Understanding takes you farther. It's really, really difficult. Either way, the data that you're going to analyze is mostly textual. Now, it's increasingly visual more, and I mean, we've got an anthropologist who was hired to do visual anthropology, Liv Stone. Some of you have probably taken classes with her. And her method is visual anthropology, and there's certainly a visual sociology. I think visual anthropology is bigger in terms of practitioners and articles and books that have been published, but there's a visual sociology. But nevertheless, the bulk of qualitative data is going to be in written form, either transcripts of your interviews or your participant observation field notes or notes from your focus groups or notes from published texts like newspapers and magazines and websites, or notes from archival text like I dealt with. Well, magazines and newspapers, old ones, but also I looked at some diaries. I looked at business records. I looked at letters and took notes on them. I won't be addressing how to analyze images. There are multiple ways to do it, but it's worth mentioning. Still, the bulk is textual. And really I'm sorry to keep coughing in your ear. I'm really sorry. But you have to use the informant's categories, not your own. This is the emic versus etic distinction from anthropology, and the book talks about it. It was a big fight in the 90s, but it's still an issue. It comes from phonemic. These are both from linguistics. Phonemic is the language speaker's categories of their own sounds, and that's inside the language. You're a Tagalog speaker in the Philippines. You have your own terms for the sounds your language makes. You're a Spanish speaker, you're an English speaker, etc. Linguists, however, who compare languages and hear a lot more sounds. I mean, the Kung in Southern Africa, they have a click language. I just reproduced it very badly. There's the in French and German and Spanish. In different places, that's R in French and German. It's J and G in Spanish, and that comparison leads to researchers developing their own categories and then imposing them when they show up in somebody to study a group. So this emic, thinking inside the group, versus etic, thinking across groups and being the quote-unquote objective researcher, is really important. And qualitative research is really good at emic approaches, getting inside their heads, seeing the world from their point of view, instead of coming in with your own ideas and just saying, well, that's what I think it is. Well, no, ask them. What do they think? That's the significance of the emic versus etic debate in anthropology. And that's what qualitative researchers try to do, use their informants categories. So we've got a bunch of data. It's raw data. Remember I said raw data isn't completely unprocessed. Merely by selecting, taking notes, or if you're doing interviews, asking particular questions and not asking other questions, just by selecting, you've already processed it some. Now you need to process it a lot more. It's very, very inductive. You start with the data and you come to conclusions, which is the exact opposite of hypothesis testing, which you take your conclusion and see if you're wrong. And if you're not wrong, you're not necessarily right, but you're not wrong, at least not with the data you have. So you provisionally say, okay, I'm not wrong. We have not rejected. We retain the hypothesis. That's not what we're doing right now. We're doing just the opposite. Start with the data and move to those conclusions. So coding. Coding is it's standard in qualitative and quantitative research, but it's the primary, I would say, way to handle qualitative research. It means something very different in quantitative research. You hear coding and quantitative. Intercoder reliability. I remember I talked about that several lectures ago. You won't hear the phrase intercoder reliability in qualitative research, or if you do, it's very strange. It's just one, maybe two researchers. Coding. So what is a code? A code is a tag or a label attached to a piece of text to express an attribute of that datum. A piece of text, a datum. So you have, let's say you're doing research on COVID-19. There are all these reports in the news. Somebody says, oh, it's a hoax, and then they test positive for it, and then they get sick, and sometimes they die. And, there's a certain number of people who find that satisfying, unfortunately. Justice was served when, in fact, somebody died. Hello. But here we are, qualitative researchers trying to get inside why they would say that when there is so much evidence to the contrary. Hoax, conspiracy, that's a different approach. Remember, I'm not a fan. But people do think it. So if you have that sentence in your data, COVID-19 was produced by a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy. A political scientist, say, who's studying voting behavior, will put a label on that statement. That's one kind of label. And a sociologist who is studying, say, social class will put a different label on that. So each qualitative researcher comes up with her or his own codes every time. It's always new. And it also depends on the awareness of the researcher, of the person who is saying it's a conspiracy. If they're a Trump supporter, if they're a feminist, if they're a radical socialist, if etc. You might code differently for those reasons also. And the process of coding, reading texts line by line, really is analysis. You are breaking a phenomenon into its parts. Open coding is really intensive reading, sometimes not only line by line. We're not even talking about sentence by sentence. We're talking less than that. Line by line, or even portion of a sentence by portion of a sentence. Clause, as linguists would say. Different clauses in a sentence. As one of the readings says, you really know your data when you're done because you've broken it down, you've analyzed it into very little bits. And this is a process that you need to be really, it's exhausting because you have to be really careful about every single word and how it relates to other words and how they relate to other parts of the sentence and how they relate to other sentences. Which means sometimes you're not going to code for 3 or 4 lines. There's really nothing there. And then you might code 3 different codes. You might apply 3 different codes within one sentence. So you've got to be just careful all the way through. It just depends on the data, and you have to be hyper aware of your data. Now, once you start coding, let's say you code an entire interview. Once you start coding, what you're going to want to do is make a list of all those codes. Once you've assigned them, like if you're doing this by hand, let's say it's the 80s and you're doing it by hand. Oh my God, people used to do this. Well, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, part of the 90s. you can then look at your second interview and see if any of those codes apply. Some of them will, and then you use them. But your second interview, if you're doing interviews, might show you different data, and therefore you'll have different codes. So you can apply the same code over and over and over. That's fine. You can constantly generate new codes, and you can do both. Generally, you're going to do both at the same time. So that's because you're looking for patterns in the data if you're doing, say, a PhD, a dissertation. This is the first time you've done this on such a scale. You've got 30 interviews from different people in wherever you're doing it. You're going to start seeing the same themes over and over, and that's where coding helps you. Stop coming up with new codes, use the same codes if they apply. And if they don't, then you are coming up with new codes. And as I said, one of the ways to sample is to keep doing interviews until you get nothing new. And if you're using all the same codes, if you're not generating any new codes, it's probably time to stop. You have enough data. You've got what qualitative researchers call data saturation. So this is what the reading means by constant comparison. Is this a code you've seen before? No. Okay, generating a new code. Yes, use it. That helps you see patterns. And next semester, Maria Schmeckley, last semester, she used it. Next semester, I bet money she'll use it again. She loves it. It's MaxQDA. And if you go to that URL, you'll see this page. This is a screenshot of the top of their main page, just to show you. MaxQDA has been around a while. I think it was developed in the 90s, I think. Certainly well before 2010. So, and it's probably the leading qualitative data analysis software. And I think ISU has a site license. Maybe the sociology department has a site license. Maria used it last semester to generate that report. Those of you who are signed up for her next fall, the report that you should have read, is one of your pieces of the literature. They used MaxQDA to go through the data. It's a very sophisticated program. It also rests on coding, but you can put all your data files into it, and then it makes coding go faster, and then you can do a lot of analysis by selecting codes and seeing who talked about them, or who you tagged as talking about those issues. And it portrays data differently and in lots of different ways. It's really, really useful and way faster. Speaking of way faster, I did just the exact opposite. So narrative analysis means organizing data to tell a story. And the first, we're on analysis 1, organizing and categorizing raw data. The first level is just organizing it in time periods. The nice thing about doing something historical, and I can tell you this personally, is that all the data are already labeled chronologically. So I know that this shockingly decadent cover of a bicycle catalog, I mean, they're kissing in public. Horrors. It's 1904, so it really would have been. I mean, a guy standing there with his dog really might be disapproving of the two of them kissing in public, because it's 1904 in rural France. But I made sure to look at the date on this. So everything's tagged already. Everything's labeled. Everything's coded chronologically, which is enormously helpful. It's not the whole story, though, and I'll get to that. And so, I went through all my notes and all the images and all the copies I made. I mean, I did a lot of photography when digital cameras came out. But in 2000 and 2001, when I was doing most of the research, digital cameras are pretty new and not very good, and you had to use a thing to stabilize them. I mean, really good digital photography now still uses an apparatus to stabilize them. But I was doing research in the Smithsonian, and I'm going page by page in this magazine, and I'm taking notes. And this guy's taking photographs. I'm so envious. I didn't have the money. But I made copies. And so I had to go through all my copies, and I had to go through all my notes in MS Word files and pull pieces of my data and quotes, direct quotes, and then put those in new files and organize them chronologically so I could tell a story. I think this should give you a sense of the wide variety of ways there is to organize and categorize qualitative data. Why it's the end of the semester and I'm only now using images, I don't know. Anyway, so once you've gone through completely, you've gone through all your data, you've exhausted it on a first pass, you've gone through it the first time, then you have to do more analysis. You have to do a higher level in a way. The book talks about finding or displaying relations between concepts, which means between your tags, between your codes. Because the codes are meant to express concepts and talk about phenomena or events. And so you compare, again, constant comparison, cross-match the codes, and then you create another level of codes. So you get your codes together and you group them logically. Which ones go together? Which concepts go together? So like if some people said COVID-19 is a hoax, whereas others said COVID-19 is a conspiracy, and then some said it's a Chinese conspiracy against the world, whereas others said it's an American conspiracy against the Chinese that went bad. Then you would take those three, Chinese conspiracy, American conspiracy, it's just a hoax completely. And you could group the three of those together as skepticism of news reports. That would be your larger category. So these are called either selective coding in grounded theory or secondary coding in other ways. I'm going to show you a chart toward the end by Johnny Saldana, who has produced a textbook on how to code, and Maria Schmeckley requires it, and he calls it secondary coding. She's going to assign the third edition of his book, and you'll see I used a diagram from the second edition. And Schutz's textbook shows forms he developed to process qualitative data. Now, that shows something that's really important about qualitative analysis. You can't take his forms and use them on your project. You have to come up with your own forms every single project. It's always new. He came up with his own. You have to come up with your own. And in that sense, there's less standardization in qualitative research than there is in quantitative research. You can take a whole class on quantitative methods, and they use chi-square and ANOVA and multiple regression and got all these names for these techniques, and everybody knows them. Now, in qualitative research, I would say the same thing happens, so I might be making too much of a distinction here, but I would say there's more variety and more making it up as you go along, less off-the-shelf technical processes in qualitative research than there is in quantitative research. You're always coming up with new forms. And you're always coming up with new ways. Like I just made up the way I wrote my dissertation on my own. And lo and behold, I was kind of sort of coding. Um, so there are a few stock ways, but it's just not as standardized. So when you read the textbook and you see those forms, you can't think, oh, I could use those. No, you can't. You can't. You have to come up with your own forms depending on what you're studying. And so when I did my own narrative analysis, what was I doing? I was telling a story with a point. I was trying to understand change over time, so I had to tell a story. Not only did I organize the data by time periods, which was easy, showed up, all my data came with tags because I made sure to get the dates as I was collecting them, always got the dates. And, sometimes I had to spend time chasing down dates. Well, then within the dates, within the time periods, I had to organize within topics too. So there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or whatever topics in each time period. That was another level of analysis that I had to do. And I just threw a phrase at you, level of analysis. That's not good. That was another step. Let's put it that way. Level 2, analysis 2, analyze your categories at the top of this page. That was the next step. Get everything in time periods, then get everything in topics within time periods. So for instance, and here's A, B, and C. When I was looking at bicycle manufacturers, what bicycles were they producing? Were they producing high wheelers? Were they producing adult tricycles? Yes, they really did that. Women rode them. They were huge. Competition with each other versus ways not to compete, and licensing is another issue that was a big deal in the 80s in terms of competition and licensing patents. So I had to look at patents for a while. Finding stores. You've got a factory. You need stores across the United States to sell bikes. Retail distribution. I had to look at that over and over and over. And on consumers, who could afford a bicycle? Only the middle classes and the elites ignored bicycles, so it was a middle class thing for quite a while. Could men ride? Could women ride? Yes, men could ride. Women, women straddling. I mean, I have a quote about women saying she, bestriding a bicycle, meaning straddling it, meaning putting it between her legs. The horror. I mean, seriously, they thought this way. Putting it between her legs was a terrible act. It was immoral. And people would say this. I've got quotes. So gender was always an issue. Different uses. You would race bicycles. You wouldn't race, you just go out in the countryside and tour. You're not using it for fun. You're going to work, commuting. I had to look at all of these things, and I had to tag my data this way too to organize within time periods. And I had to make sure to repeat issues across time periods, or if new issues came up, then I would have to address those and code those. In the high wheel era, only men rode, because if you wore a skirt on a high wheeler, you would die. You'd rotate the pedals once and you would fall forward and break your neck. And they wrote this. I've got a quote saying exactly that. So they had these tricycles, which had 2 high wheels on either side and a seat slung in the middle. Ladies could ride them. And then you don't have that. You've got the bicycle, and you just take out the top tube, and you can accommodate a skirt. And you put a little screen over the back wheels so the skirt doesn't get tangled, and you've got ladies' bicycles, because dresses were, you could not appear in public. I mean, there were places you'd get arrested. Appearing in public wearing pants or bloomers if you were female. They did arrest some women for wearing pants. So you're wearing a dress, period, end of story. And so I've got to follow these issues over and over and over. So women are finally riding, and it's a big fat deal in the 1880s, and it's not quite a deal in the 1890s, and it's even less a deal after the year 1900. I still have to follow them across periods. But new stuff comes up. Now, workers are riding after 1900. They can afford them. Prices dropped. So I have to raise that. Consumers changed, your uses changed. So I had to do all this coding for that too. Corroborate or legitimate your conclusions. So I've got 2 lines here. If possible, code between data collection sessions. So when you code, you're thinking inductively. Let's look at the data first and come to some conclusions. And, I said, I'm sitting in the National Library of France, eating my cheese and baguette for lunch, in between looking at these old magazines on microfilm. I may not have been coding, but I was thinking through my data. And everybody who does an interview or does repeated participant observation is maybe they won't be coding, but they're going to be doing something with that in their head. And they're going to come to some sort of conclusions. And so point 2 here, field insights or conclusions, means you're going to seek more data to corroborate or legitimate those conclusions. That's more deductive. That's a little more like hypothesis testing. But in a way, it's really more like checking a hunch. It's not the formal, let's develop a hypothesis and test it. It's not it at all when you're doing qualitative data. It's, I think this is what I see. Let's check. And so let's get more data. But that is much more a deductive approach. So you're going back and forth between induction and deduction in your head, or should be, as you're collecting qualitative data. And this is, again, collecting data and analyzing data happen simultaneously. And as Winfried Avogo keeps telling me, you do that in quantitative data, but it's very obvious when you're doing qualitative data. So once you've gone through your data twice, and let's say I've gone through my data twice and organized it in a story, whereas somebody else has gone through their data twice and organized it in basic codes or open codes and then selective or secondary codes, then you go through it yet again. Let's say I wrote it up. I wrote my story. Well, then, okay, what's the point of my story? Or somebody's done their coding and then they've done selective coding and then they wrote it up. What's the point of their analysis of these themes? What do these themes tell them? These are your theoretical conclusions, or at least your conclusions. Maybe they are theoretical, maybe they're merely conceptual, but you come to the big picture. What's your study about? If you're really inductive, these emerge. That's the word they use. They emerge from the data and from your very intensive analysis. If you're only partly inductive, they partly emerge and you partly impose them. And so if you group your secondary categories, media skepticism might be one of those of COVID-19, might be one of those secondary categories that might go with other categories. You might find that goes with social class, that poor people, working class people are in general, from your data, much more skeptical of what they see in the newspaper, what they see in news sites about this pandemic. So those would be 2 selective codes, and you group them together, and that might be one of your major conclusions, theme. The oppressed, the dispossessed, the marginalized have much more skepticism, which is not, all that surprising a finding if that's what you're finding. And that's right now what I would predict. They have reason to be skeptical of all official stories. But that's just an example of what I'm talking about. You're grouping your, 10 to 20 secondary codes into 2 or 3 or 4 major codes. And those 2 or 3 or 4 major codes are your conclusions. And then you're looking for relations between the major categories. Sometimes these are going to be causal. One set of themes seems to be a set of causes, and one set of themes seems to be an effect or a set of effects. And so you do have a causal relationship. Other times you're not even looking for causation, as I said. They just seem to be related somehow. Maybe they're related back and forth, or maybe they just go together and you don't know exactly how. But you do look for relations between your major categories once you have them. And here's remember I said, Johnny Saldana, the coding manual for qualitative researchers. And as I said, Maria will be using the 3rd edition. This is from page 13 of the 2nd edition, but he's probably going to use this again. This is what the whole process looks like. You code, 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 code on the left. And then you've got maybe subcodes or larger codes, categorical codes, and then you've got themes and concepts. That's what I've just talked about. And then the relations between the themes and concepts might be assertions or your theory. You've related the themes to each other. In narrative analysis, you're looking at basic patterns over time. And I think these 2 images, which are they're literally snapshots. They're just frozen seconds in time. One's from the 1880s. They're riding high-wheelers. Yes, they really rode bicycles that high, and yes, they really were that dangerous that, women wore skirts on those and they would die right away. Men would wear those pants and they would still occasionally die or break their forearms as they fell, which is why we have the bicycles on the right. In the 1920s, you can see that old car. That's on the Champs-Élysées, and that's the Arc de Triomphe. Arc de Triomphe? I'm not sure. I've been there. And yeah, the Champs-Élysées, that's this huge street in the shopping district. Well, in the 1920s, you got people riding to work. And that's a shift of bicycle riding patterns over time. You've got upper middle class men in clubs riding for leisure in the 1880s, and the vast majority in the 1920s are workers going to their factory or store jobs, their retail jobs on a bike. So now I was definitely not doing something purely inductive. I was very much imposing my ideas of markets on the data, and I was aware of it at the time, and I'm even more aware of it now. And I'm not apologizing for it. Those were my research questions, but that's something I want to end with. We've got one more slide. That when people say they are purely inductive, be skeptical. They're coming in with thoughts already. There's a debate in grounded theory about whether you should even do a literature review because you want to be that inductive, you want to be that fresh. And some will say, don't even do a literature review, just go get data. And others say, no, you can still be fresh. But again, I'm going to say you're selecting, because you already have thoughts in your head, you're selecting data. It's never 100% inductive. You're already selecting the data. That's a deductive process. And that's what my dissertation shows as a methodological issue. And that's what a lot of research shows. You come in with your question already. So I hope I've gotten across a strong sense of the many ways to implement the purposes of qualitative research in the analysis of qualitative data. And that's all I got. So those of you who aren't going to listen to the lecture on how to write the final paper, what I'm trying to do in the final paper, trying to have you do in the final paper, take care. And I hope to literally see you on campus next fall. And those of you who are going to listen, talk to you soon.